Welcome to this discussion and presentation about the future of wellbeing in Minnesota across all ages. Obviously, an incredibly important topic, something that's going to affect us all, and this whole idea about how do we thrive in our lives as we go through our different sort of age profiles, and how do we think about thriving opportunities for people as they age in society and as they become active retirees and so on. So the point of this keynote is to explore the topic of the future of wellbeing. Just as a little bit of context, my name is David Burrell. I'm the CEO of Future IQ. We're a research and consulting company that does a lot of work looking at future trends and what does that mean for people and what are the implications of emerging trends on us as people and as society. Obviously, today, what I want to present is a series of data points that I think are really relevant to introducing the topic of the future of wellbeing. So I want to explore the topic of future thinking. Obviously, through a series of macro events like a global pandemic, I think we're all more attuned and understand the importance of future thinking. I would also argue that a lot of the data points I'm going to show you highlight the importance of future thinking as we prepare ourselves for the future that's coming to us. So a couple of things to think about in terms of how to be effective in future thinking. Obviously, we're trying to explore and anticipate a range of plausible futures. So think about different ways the future might play out. As we do that, there are two things that are really important. So one is trajectory, so the direction of change, and one is velocity, the speed of change. So in other words, what direction do we want to head in, or are we heading in, and how fast do we need to move? And obviously that we can start to explore multiple potential trends and think about the shape and contours of the future. I want to share some data points that I think are going to shape our future. I want to hit, first of all, on about key emerging trends shaping the future of the Midwest, and in a macro sense, the future of wellbeing. Some of these trends which I want to talk about are the importance of food, energy, and water. I think that's a really interesting sweet spot for the upper Midwest and for Minnesota. Implications of climate change, what does that mean for where we live and how we live? Shifting societal values and population shifts, housing shortages and availability, workplace transitions, accelerating speed of change, medical and wealth systems change, and the impact of technology. A raft of really big, important topics. And I want to talk about how these could come together and create very interesting futures. So I want to start off by talking about three big buckets of macro trends. Three, demographics, population, and mass urbanization. I want to talk about that at a global scale and then bring it down home to what it might mean in the Twin Cities and in Minnesota. I want to talk about energy, food, water, and climate change, and technology driving change. And then I want to finish talking a bit about some work we've been doing in the future of wellbeing. So let's dive into some of these macro future trends. So let's start our exploration of the future by talking about demographics, population, and mass urbanization. So very big picture, and then we'll drill it down to a more local context. But at a macro scale, global population is increasing. We know that by the time we get to 2050, we're going to be close to 9 billion people, and that growth is occurring predominantly in the less developed countries. If we break this down a little bit further and we look at some data from the UN, and this on the left here talks about the population pyramids for the developed countries. So think of North America, Europe, Japan, places like that. On the right-hand side is the population pyramid for the less developed countries or the developing countries. The way these are structured, they're in 4-year age increments, male and female. And you can see that the developed countries, which we're obviously part of in Minnesota, have this sort of bulge in the middle with this sort of population, but a fairly extensive aging population or senior population in society. On the right-hand side, in the developing countries, you can see, however, they have a massive surge of younger people coming through their population cohorts. If we look at it in terms of where the percent change in projected population is going to be occurring, say in the first half of this century, the red areas are the most rapidly growing portions of the world, and the orange follows, and so on. you can see that the equatorial regions and predominantly Africa are the areas of the world where we have these rapidly growing populations. You may be wondering, well, what does this mean to the future well-being in Minnesota? Well, keep watching these charts, because I'm going to draw some connections here that I do think some of these global changes that are occurring are going to have significant impact on our society, what our society composition is, and how we approach aging in Minnesota, and how we approach well-being in the future. So we see this massive growth of population occurring through Africa. I want to talk about mass urbanization. And so I'm going to go through a 100-year timeline. So starting in 1950, so this is a stylized map of the world. So we have North America and South America on the left-hand side, Europe in the middle, and Asia on the right-hand side. Each bubble here represents a country, and the size of the bubble represents the number of people in 1950 who are living in urban environments. And the color coding simply relates to what was the percent of the population that was in these urbanized environments, again, of over 100,000 people. So in 1950, in the United States, we had 101 million people in urban populations, 64% urbanized. So it's kind of close to half and half. So very much typical of a lot of the world, somewhat an agrarian population. So people living in farms and rural areas and regional areas, and sort of about half the population living in these bigger urban centers. However, that's changed dramatically, and this is what we call mass urbanization. So if we jump forward to 2020, you can see that this picture of the world changes dramatically. If I just toggle backwards and forwards, so 1950, 2020, much closer to today. At this point, the United States has nearly 300 million people living in these urban centers of over 100,000 people, and we're 85% urbanized. But you can see this phenomenon is across the world. You can see we have these massive explosions in China and India, but all through Europe and North and South America, where people are increasingly concentrating into these bigger urban centers. I do think we're at the point where we have to start to think of ourselves as an urban dwelling species, as opposed to the more traditional agrarian species that we would have been in the 1950s. If we jump forward to 2050, you can see it just keeps blowing up, right? So at this point, we're at 365 million people in the United States in urban centers of over 100,000 people, 90% urbanized, very much an urban dwelling species. And that, to put it in practical numbers, is adding 50,000 people a week to cities in the United States net per week, and we're going to do it for the next 30 years. And that growth comes from people who are being born into those cities' environments, people who are moving to those from other locations. But basically what we're doing is just getting bigger and bigger urban centers. And of course, Minneapolis and St. Paul is one of those. If you look through the upper Midwest and you look at the kind of distribution of people across the landscape, increasingly people are moving to these big centers. Minneapolis, St. Paul is one of them, right? But then you could think of Kansas City and Chicago, Dallas, Fort Worth, other big centers, even Des Moines, Iowa, big centers where people are concentrating. What that's leading to is this redistribution of people into and around these mega cities. And I want to talk about what this might mean in terms of aging well in each context, and what are the strategies we need to think about the future of well-being in each of these kind of significant zones associated with these metropolises. So we have the downtown environment, obviously, undergoing its own kind of iteration over the recent decades. We've seen more living in downtown environments. We see that sort of greater concentration. If you take the suburban environment, where we've done quite a bit of work in Minnesota with places like City of Edina and Wayzata and so on, where these suburbs that are in these kind of commuter zones are also undergoing their own urbanization, and really interesting initiatives being created to create more livable and better places for people to age in place, and really focusing on well-being and mobility and all those type of exciting things. And then we have the peri-urban space, which is that sort of larger kind of distribution centers around the periphery of these metropolises. And then, of course, we have the big agricultural production and recreation zones that sort of span out from these mega cities. The really interesting question, I think, is how we think about designing environments in each one of these different arcs that really is able to help people age well, have that vitality right through their life in different stages. And how do we think about that as people are increasingly seeing these urban environments as their home, as part of society? So some other things that are also undergoing significant change that I think are also going to have really big influence on the future well-being and how we think about tackling a population that is changing in its demographic profile. So on the left here, we have the United States of America, 2022 census data. Again, age pyramids, male and female, male on the left, female on the right. The big red arrows here point to what is the well-documented two big cohorts in society today. So the millennial population and then the baby boomer population. But we're undergoing a profound demographic shift. And if you look at 10 years and you look at the shape and the makeup of this age pyramid, you can see it changes dramatically. You can see that we have this larger cohort in the middle, which is the millennial population, becoming much more influential in society. But we start to see the boomer influence, as it's called, right, starting to fade away as that population loses that significance of that sort of dominant cohort. But what's interesting to note, it still becomes a very large portion of society, and there are a lot of people who are living, over 70 years and are kind of, have very strong and healthy lives as they age going forward. So that's 2022 to 2032. Let's jump forward another 10 years. So on the left here is we have the 22 data. On the right, we have 2042. So we're looking 20 years into the future. And if you want to think about what society will be shaped by then, and if we think about it from age cohorts, the high school cohort today, down here on the left-hand side, not a dominant part of society, but by the time we get 20 years out, it's going to be a much more influential portion of society. So thinking about the types of values that they have, the things that are important to them, that will be much more prevailing in society. And while we see the boomer influence largely gone, you still do see this increasingly large portion of people who are in the above 70 years of age, and still, active in society. This is going to be a very important component as we think about the future of well-being and how these cityscapes need to evolve to accommodate people in all their different ages, but who may have different desires for how they recreate, how they live, and so on. So one last piece I want to talk about as a data point in terms of how I think society is changing and will be changing is this looks at foreign-born percentages of people in the United States. It goes from 1850 on the left-hand side, 2060 on the right-hand side. So the bars or the columns here, they're the actual numbers of people who are foreign-born. So not even first generation, but foreign-born. And the green line is the percent of foreign-born people who are making up the United States society. And we're almost at the point, in fact, we're only sort of 5 years shy of when the foreign-born percent of the population is forecast to be higher than any time since the 1850s, which was a period of historic high, or going into a period of an historic high. Really fascinating that we see this sort of return to this high percent of foreign-born residents and members of society. Because if you'd gone back to 1850 and you thought about the United States, you would have probably said it was kind of a melting pot of people from all over the place, pursuing their dreams and looking for opportunity. And really, we're very close to the societal construction in a similar sort of a percentage point. What's interesting is that it's coming off an historic low. So the 1970s was when we had an historic low of foreign-born residents, but that is increasing rapidly and is likely to continue to increase for the next decades. What that will bring will be different voices, different cultures, and different desires that people have for society and how they want to live and operate in society, and how we think about well-being through all the ages of society, knowing that we've got different cultures coming. I would argue that the data points that I'm showing you set the environment for what I would call rapid societal shifts in values, or shifts in values and thinking of society. Let me explain more. So I use these advertising pamphlets from some period ago to illuminate this point, right? So on the left here, it says, blow on her face and she'll follow you anywhere. And on the right, it talks about how soon should babies start to drink cola. We look at this and we kind of either grimace or we probably chuckle. This looks so out of step with societal values today. But not that long ago, this was very contemporary and very sophisticated advertising for its day. But somehow or other, if you just take smoking, somehow or other, smoking has gone from being very appealing and attractive to suddenly it's illegal in most places. And that's an example of a shifting societal value. Societal value shifts, interestingly, typically don't just occur gradually. They occur at step points. So if you think of some more recent examples, think of Black Lives Matter, Me Too movement, where something happens and there's a rapid reset of societal values. I would argue that we're going into a decade ahead of us where we're going to see an acceleration in shifting societal values driven by changes in age demographics and profiles in society, new voices entering the conversation, people living in different locations and living in different ways. And I think the future well-being is one of those things that's going to be one of those rapid shifting societal values where we may see new thinking emerge and new appetite for different ways of living and for well-being as we move forward. Another really interesting piece, if we think about distribution of people in society, is where people are living. So this is some data from just before the pandemic, which looked at where there was essentially a housing surplus or a housing shortage based on demand, right? And it was somewhat reflecting where people were moving to. You'll notice on here, there's not a lot of the big kind of cities that people talk a lot about in terms of, where people are moving to, the Pacific Northwest, Salt Lake City, Denver, Colorado, Austin, Texas, and so on, even Georgia, Florida, DC. Interestingly, Minneapolis, St. Paul is one of those locations. So there is some good anecdotal information that people, particularly the younger populations, are now seeking out and moving to parts of the country where they think it is offering the right kind of urban environment and the right kind of future for them. And it does seem that Minneapolis, St. Paul is on the radar for a number of people who are thinking about where they might live in the future. I want to explore this a little more because I think that's going to bring some interesting new opportunities for how society evolves, but also how we may need to adapt to well-being and so on. So let's take these big buckets. So demographic, population, and mass urbanization. What do we think that means for the future well-being in Minnesota at any age? So we've got all these changing kind of components. How might that shape the future of well-being? Some thoughts from myself, right? Some of my predictions and observations, please draw your own conclusions. But I do think generational change is coming, which will trigger widespread upheaval of norms. I think we should be prepared to be surprised to the upside by the type of changes that may be coming. Cultural differences will become even more important. I do think that there's societal value shifts will occur where we start to appreciate cultural differences. Even in Minnesota, we have some important tribal communities and different voices, different sort of segments of population that I think are going to find their place as we think about how society evolves and how people kind of coexist and how we have perhaps differing needs and values, but we want to figure out how to learn to live together and to focus on human well-being and human vitality. At a larger scale, I think people and industries will continue to cluster around mega cities, the twin cities included, and perhaps in specialized cities and regional centers. So think, for example, like the Bemidji's or the St. Clouds or the Rochesters or the Mankato's. I do see those centres growing, and the Duluths, of course, and becoming, in some ways, almost specialised cities where people are moving to them for recreational or educational opportunities or healthcare or to be part of emerging bioeconomies and so on. I do think this is an area that will be very interesting to watch evolve. And of course, then thinking about how does well-being play out in all those locations, because as a company, Future IQ, we've worked in many of these regional centres. And I can tell you that people are interested and concerned about livability and well-being. And I think it's going to take different shapes and have different sort of flavours in each one of these locations, both at the urban rings, but also in different regional centres. All right, so that's a big set of topics there around demographics, mass urbanisation, and perhaps shifting societal values. Let's now turn to the next portion of the macro trends. Now let's talk about the next big bucket of macro trends. So energy, water, food, and climate change. And I do think that these trend points or these topics create a very interesting future for Minnesota and actually have global implications. So let me lay out my data points and my conclusions from this set of macro trends. So first of all, some work that's been done by the University of Minnesota, Professor Jordan there, looked at, we've got this global population growth occurring, 25% by 2050. However, it will lead to an uneven increase in demand for resources. So energy demand is forecast to increase by 50%, freshwater demands by 40%, food demands by up to 60%. And why this is not all 25% is a lot of the world is coming out of what we talked about, that agrarian environment, and in many cases, agrarian poverty, and people are moving into a more industrialized, urbanized life, which is going to consume more resources, and people are going to want more choice and so on, things we're very used to and take for granted. Increasing the global population is going to be seeking that, which is going to drive these increased demands for food, water, and energy that are disproportionate from just the population growth. The challenge is, how do we provide that, and what are the implications? So if we take energy, for example, only a decade and a half ago, people were very concerned about the ability to be able to supply energy for the world. However, technology and renewable energies have really been game-changing. So we've got this potential now for unlimited cheap electricity or cheap energy. We're seeing this pivot starting to occur from fossil fuels, which is a constrained resource, to really the abundant resource of renewable energies. And the electrification of the world is accelerating, driven by these renewable energies. So that's a pretty exciting trend line, and certainly provides a pathway to provide what the world needs looking out long term. However, when we start to turn to topics like fresh water and food, it's not quite as promising. So let's look at fresh water. Already we have nearly 500 million people in 29 countries who face severe water shortages. As much as 2/3 of the world's population could be water stressed by 2025. We're seeing that accelerate with climate change. You see these sort of events of drought and floods and so on, creating an enormous amount of stress for many of the world's population. Half the world's rivers and lakes are seriously polluted. Interestingly, though, the upper, middle, and northeast of the US has 20% of the global surface freshwater resources. And of course, in Minnesota, we have our own direct connection to abundant lakes and of different scales and rivers. A really extraordinary percent of the world's freshwater resources originate and are connected to Minnesota. Let's talk about the implications of that. I also want to talk about food, and because it's really core to human nutrition, human well-being, and the ability for humans to have vital and productive lives. But we have a real dichotomy in nutrition. We have something like 2 billion people on the planet who, in one way or another, don't get enough, either not enough vitamins and minerals, not enough calories, or chronically undernourished. About 2 billion people. On the same hand, we have about 2 billion people who in some way or another get too much. So we have overweight and obesity issues, children that are overweight. So this really kind of odd sort of divergence in access to food around the world. But let's keep coming back to Minnesota, right? And so what this diagram looks at is the biomass resources per square kilometre in the United States. And it's a pretty good approximation of crop production as we look at it from the point of growing food. If you look at here, the dark blues and the reds are the highest producing areas, and these are normalized to tons per square kilometre. And this straddles right into Minnesota, northern Iowa, and parts of Illinois. But incredibly productive part of the world. In fact, this dark blue patches here are of global significance in terms of the ability to be able to produce food. And I want to talk about how important we think this area will become as we move forward through the coming decades. So let's first of all look at where hunger is emergent as an issue in the world. So the burgundies and the oranges are areas where we already have significant chronic hunger prevalent, which is measured in many cases by the percent of children under 5 years of age who are underweight. This occurs primarily through Africa and the equatorial regions of the world, the very same regions that I showed earlier, where the fastest growing populations are and where some of the largest populations in the planet are, that we have this compounding implication of rapidly growing populations, and we already have endemic hunger. This is the 2020 hunger map. Now let's overlay this and start to look at the implications of climate change. So what we have here is the areas that are in red and orange is where the forecast is for crop production, agricultural productivity to decline as a function of climate change over time. And the greens are where the forecast is for potential increases in agricultural yield. What's really interesting about this is that the same areas where we have hunger and we have rapidly growing populations, the equatorial regions in Africa, is where we're likely to see the biggest negative impact of climate change. And what we call the northern mid-latitudes, which runs right through parts of Minnesota and northern Europe, is where we're likely to see the increased ability to grow food because the growing season gets longer. You know, we get these much bigger shoulders on the growing season. Really fundamental shift in terms of how food production is going to be located around the world. Obviously, the area where we are is one that has some somewhat tailwinds in terms of agricultural productivity. If you drill it in a little bit closer, right, I'm now going to show you a series of charts that are about the US. And I think this starts to get to where people are going to live and what it's going to be like to be living in the future. So here we have, and I'm going to show you a series of analysis. And I think these are becoming better as the science behind it gets better. And I think they give us a bit of a clue about what the future might look like. So the greens is where we're going to see potential agricultural farm yield increases. And the purple is where we're going to see potential declines, and actually quite severe. So we're talking about portions of Texas and Oklahoma may see crop yields drop by more than 70%. And we may see significant crop yield increase again through this real sweet spot in the upper Midwest. If you look at extreme heat and humidity events, so looking at a couple of decades, what the forecast might look like that, seeing increasing predominance of extreme events in the south of the country, really centering around the sort of border and the Texas region and Florida, but some very uncomfortable forecasts there in terms of climate for the future. If you look at the prevalence of wildfires and how that might look, we've already started to see this occurring in some of the big fires in recent years, but seeing this perhaps real danger of uncontrollable wildfires occurring on the West Coast and the Rockies. Coastal inundation, potential for sea levels to rise and areas that will be affected by coastal inundation. You know, you're right through the East Coast, obviously, portions of the West Coast. What all of that creates, of course, is this big question about where do people live? You know, so if suddenly the South's not as good, the coast is not as good, the West is not as good, where is the ideal place for people to live? And what this is looking at here is this is where the ideal location for humans to occupy based on temperature and precipitation for the last 6,000 years. What's going to happen is that zone is going to move north in the coming decades and moving right up into Minnesota in terms of being in the optimum human habitation zone. If you put all of that together, what some of the forecasting is now suggesting is the impact on GDP is that we're going to see GDP destruction, so decline of GDP due to all of these factors coming together, the cost of weather events, the loss of productivity, perhaps declining GDP in the South. And then we see this sort of string of sweet spots across the north of the United States where we may see GDP increase. And I wonder if that does not mean that we're on this tipping point where we're going to see new migration patterns, perhaps people moving from the south to north, from the coasts to the inland, and perhaps the upper Midwest, perhaps Minnesota, are going to be really important havens for people as the world starts to change. Couple that with the ability to be able to produce food, it creates a really interesting proposition for what the future of Minnesota and what the future well-being might be like in locations like this. So what does this all mean in the Minnesota context? Some of my predictions and observations. I think we're seeing a growing disconnect between where food will be consumed and where it can be grown. This is one region, obviously, where it can be grown, right? And I think the importance of those big food producing areas and their connection to the global markets is only going to get stronger. I think we're going to see new migration patterns emerge. I think there's anecdotal information that's already starting to occur, but I do think that the Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota are going to be places that people will look to as they see the more extreme implications of climate change bite in. But of course, our urban environments are going to need to evolve as well. We're going to be living in different climatic regimes, and we have to think about how we reinvent and readapt our urban environments. And that work is starting already. You see cities that are starting to accelerate tree planting and starting to think about stormwater. But I think it's going to be an enormous raft of innovation and a whole series of cascading sort of actions that will allow us to better evolve and adapt our urban landscapes as we move forward. So big picture there in terms of energy, food, water, climate change. Now let's turn and talk about technology and potential implications of technology. So now let's turn and talk about technology and the speed of change. So this is the third big bucket of these macro trends that tie in with what we think is happening in terms of societal shifts and distribution of people, the whole food, energy, water, climate change combination. Then, of course, we had this technology overlay and the speed of change issue. I think this is something for us to really be thinking about as we contemplate the future of well-being and how fast we might have to move. Remember, we talked about trajectory and velocity. Well, this is a really key part of the velocity story. So let's look at it in terms of technology. So this is looks at cumulative capability of different major digital technologies over the last sort of 70 to 80 years, from 1950 through to heading towards 2030. What we're seeing here is we've seen these big surges of technology. So we've had the mainframe, we had the desktop PC, sort of web computing and so on. But we've really now got this constellation of three major digital technologies that have come together. So cloud computing, big data analytics, data visualization, Internet of Things, smart machine have combined as a set of technologies to create an environment where artificial intelligence can flourish. And of course, artificial intelligence has the promise of being able to deliver extraordinary outcomes for humans and for us even to start to think about the implications of human well-being, individual medicine and really refined technologies that help us, stay active and engaged as we age and as we become, sort of more senior portions of society, which is going to be really important given that we have a big chunk of people who are moving into those more senior demographics. Of course, the question with artificial intelligence is that people also get alarmed by that, right? And this was some predictions made by a series of experts from Oxford and Yale universities, and they looked at when would artificial intelligence exceed the capability of human beings, and really we're on track for this, if not even going a little faster. So translating languages, I mean, that's now extraordinary. The ability to be able to write high school essays. Already we're seeing the ability for artificial intelligence to be able to construct, very coherent narratives and so on. Autonomous vehicles. Then really working into the more creative and the more precision sort of science areas as a surgeon and maths research. But basically, for many of us in our lifetimes, we're going to see artificial intelligence, achieve the same competence as human beings. That, of course, will bring some interesting questions and debate. Some people see it as a potential savior for helping solve many of the grand challenges we've not been able to crack so far. Other people get concerned about, us being displaced as humanity. But I'm always the optimist. I do think that we'll figure this out and that we'll be able to harness this emerging technologies in very powerful ways. But it will come with accelerating speed of change. And I wanted to sort of walk you through this a little bit. I'm always very interested in food and agricultural systems because it's so foundational to human well-being. Being able to think about the sort of types of food we have and how they come together. This is a schematic of what it might look like when we see a series of important technologies come together. Now, my point of this is that I don't think we're yet seeing these technologies really converge at system level integration, but within the next decade or two, they will. So here we have these colored bars at the lower left. Think of these as exponential technologies, all fascinating technologies that are, accelerating in their capability just almost on a daily basis. Biotech, neurotech, nanotech, all these things, sensing, 3D printing, robotics, drones, and so on. What happens when those exponential technologies couple together into systems and we get this rapid progression of systems? So think of, I did this as a food overlay, food and agriculture. So think of vertical farming, synthetic foods, 3D food printing, drone delivery, autonomous tractors, and so on, global connectivity. We get this rapid acceleration. I think we can get a clue of that if we look at logistics today. The ability to be able to order something online and have it delivered to your front door in a very short period of time with an enormous amount of complex arrangements and organization going on in the background. That's a sort of a glimpse, I think, of what some of these integrated systems might look like. Now, overlay on top of this, think about human well-being and think about all the things that could change, that could create a whole different environment for us to be thinking about human well-being. So think about like urban landscapes, think about real-time personal medicine and monitoring, think about the technology that helps to detect diseases and that keeps us operating at optimum levels. So that the real possibility for people to be able to live very vital and healthy lives through all the different stages of their life. So think of the sort of the cures to many sort of issues, like the concerns like about heart disease and cancer and overweight and obesity. Imagine systems of technology that might start to address that and elevate the entire ability for humans to be able to live productive and happy lives and have a real sense of well-being and vitality. Might sound a little sort of optimistic and out there, but I really do think we're on the edge of a lot of technologies coming together that are going to have really profound impact for people who are fortunate enough in the world to be able to access that. And of course, Minnesota, with its really strong medical cluster concentration and research capability, I think is going to be really at the epicenter of thinking about these systems for well-being coming together. Couple of sort of ways to illuminate this and bring it into sort of clearer focus is this is a chart that looks at the cost of sequencing a human genome and how that cost has dropped over time. So from sort of 2001, it essentially is $100 million, the whole genome project. Whereas today we're down into the hundreds to sequence the human genome. That cost is dropping faster than Moore's law. And so you get this very aggressive acceleration of the ability to be able to use, personalized medicine and to think about, very customized medical applications, because we're able to understand each individual's sequencing and what their vulnerabilities are and so on, right? But you see, in this case, you go from $100 million to hundreds of dollars for the same piece of diagnostic, and we're seeing that occur across all sorts of different technologies. I think this is the speed of change issue, that it's exponential, and it's going to bring really rapidly bring new possibilities to us. If you look at a macro scale and where the US fits in, I want to just show you this, because I do think we're on the edge of a very interesting time for the United States. So this is some data that looks at high-skilled and technological intensive manufacturing exports, right? So a really good way to think about, high-end science and the conversion of that into the commercial sector and application in manufacturing and medicine and all sorts of fields, right? You can see here, this data is from 2020. The United States is number 1, China's 2, Germany's 3. Excuse me. What's really interesting, though, if you look at today's world, Germany and the UK are really caught up in the Ukrainian war. The forecasts are that the German economy is going to be most severely affected by any recessionary trends. The United Kingdom, with Brexit, has really lost a lot of its competitive edge. So a couple of major competitors sort of are going to have their own issues to deal with. China's obviously sort of on a different trajectory. Japan's facing aging issues. Korea's in facing a lot of conflict. It does seem to me that this sets the stage for the United States, if not North America, to really be on the cusp of leading global technology and innovation and really jumping forward, right? I do think this country has the potential to apply science and to innovation and commercialize that really fast. And I think this sets the stage here for perhaps a very exciting time for the US, which will have really significant implications in areas like medical devices and those things. So I get pretty excited about the potential for the future well-being in the United States and, of course, in Minnesota as I look at that other data. So technology and the speed of change. What do all these future trends mean for the future well-being in Minnesota across all ages? For sure, we're going to face a period of rapid change. I think there are waves of disruption and technology that are reshaping education, industries, economies, and lifestyles. And I think that speed of change is exponential. So I think what we're going to start to see is this acceleration of change, which is going to be a real positive for well-being and for people in all different age categories and different abilities. I think we're going to see some real advantage and optimization to help people really craft and live lifestyles that are very supportive of well-being and maintain vitality and happiness and well-being and so on through all the different ages of society. So 3 big buckets there. I don't know what you draw from that. My conclusion is that Minnesota is in a sweet spot. It is positioned from a point of view of its appeal as a place for human beings to live, the fundamental climatic environment, our ability to be able to produce food, the ability for our society in Minnesota to absorb change and to evolve. It's not polarized as much as some places. It really is a society that's willing to kind of think and evolve, absorb new cultures, new thinking. And then, of course, I think it's, we're really in the epicenter of a lot of very important medical science, and for the ability to be able to have that applied and for it to impact our lifestyles. And at the same time, we have many municipalities in Minnesota who are working really hard to think about innovative ways to keep people, living in great urban environments or regional centers, and be able to really optimize that for people. So I will now want to just talk to you briefly about some work that we were doing last year, which is about the future well-being as a foresight component and what we drew as a conclusion for the future of Minnesota. Now let me finish my discussion here. We're talking about the Future Wellbeing Foresight project, which we work with a group of stakeholders from across Minnesota, but concentrated in the Twin Cities. through 2001 and 2022, and we produced this foresight report. It draws together a lot of the macro trends I just talked about and what the conclusion was of those stakeholders in terms of what it meant for the future of Minnesota. There was a real view that Minnesota is in a sweet spot, as I mentioned, has the ability to be able to really capture on the future well-being as a key part of the proposition of the state. So really, there was this very compelling opportunity. When you look at those macro trends, the conclusion we drew was that Minnesota has this compelling opportunity to contribute to the future of human well-being at all ages. Why? Because we've got this unique combination of natural resources, favorable climatic trends, the ability to be able to develop and apply technology, the way the society here functions and so on. And so there's this opportunity to leverage productive capability in our abundant natural resources. But really importantly, I think where the group landed was there's a potential as a sanctuary for human well-being, that there are going to be many people in this country as well as elsewhere in the world who will have unfortunate circumstances from a point of view of climatic regimes and ability to be able to access technology. So Minnesota, the conclusion we had was it has this opportunity to both be a very important generator of ideas and technology, but also offer a sanctuary for people who are looking for perhaps a more climate resilient location. We held a summit in May 2022, and there were some really key themes that came out of this. And I think this really helps inform our discussions in this conference about the future well-being and so on. That some of the things we saw was there's a potential to build on Minnesota's strong collaborative ecosystem environment. There's already a culture of collaboration here. The view was that could be deepened and that could help accelerate innovation even more. And I think this conference and the gatherings that are occurring around Minnesota are a really important part of developing that ecosystem, and particularly targeting kind of well-being at all different ages in society, but particularly people who are in their more senior years. There's an opportunity to deepen Minnesota's global fluency. The idea was that if we want to have an impact at a global scale from a point of view of well-being, then we need to make sure we're fluent in terms of norms and cultures and be connected to what's going on around the world. There was also a strong view that there's an opportunity to foster the image as a global destination location. So we certainly see that in Rochester as a very targeted sort of medical and well-being destination. Our view was that lens could broaden and Minnesota could become part of that larger conversation. Opportunity, of course, to aggressively pursue and build Minnesota's existing bio and health economy. We have a strong health economy, but there's also a very interesting bioeconomy. And what a bioeconomy is, it's things that are connected to the resources that come from nature, so food and all those type of elements. There's a really important place that Minnesota has to play in the future of feeding the world. But thinking about food as medicine and food as health and so on, a real opportunity there to pursue and build that. And then, of course, there was a lot of appetite for this notion of developing Minnesota as a role model region in well-being services and technology. So I think, as we go through this conference and with lots of other creative discussions, this notion of how does Minnesota really kind of get optimized and perfect here, but all think about that as an important demonstration at a global scale in terms of being able to bring together the thinking and the urban landscapes and the wellness and health systems and the food system, bring that together to create this really interesting well-being environment. So with that, I want to thank you for your time. I hope that some of those macro trends were of interest and set the stage. The conclusion, the takeaway from our point of view is that we're incredibly optimistic about the future well-being in Minnesota, and that the ability for this to be able to, really truly be a very age-friendly location, but actually a place that people can thrive at all ages in society. We think all the ingredients are there. It really just takes that creative thought and that effort of many people like yourselves to lean into this and start to build and activate on this future. So thank you very much.